Java Sea, 1943. Sergeant Taro Horiba stares at the impossible sprawled across the grass. Pink skin that gleams like salmon flesh, webbed fingers that end in needle-sharp claws, and a mouth filled with teeth that belong in nightmares, not nature. The village chief nods grimly. Orang Ikan, he whispers. Fishman. His men had seen these creatures dancing in lagoons, swimming like humans through moonlit waters. But this was different. This was proof. Horiba had come to the Kei Islands as part of Japan's Pacific Campaign, expecting to fight Americans and British, not wrestle with mysteries that fishermen had whispered about for over a century. Yet here, in this remote corner of Indonesia, folklore and history were colliding in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the encounter itself, it's how the documented accounts of military observers touch the ancient oral traditions of Malay fishing communities. This is the story of that encounter, a documented event that science tried to forget. The year 1943 was pivotal in the Pacific theater. Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia with stunning speed, occupying the Dutch East Indies by March 1942. But their rapid expansion came with unexpected complications, like discovering that some islands harbored mysteries their military textbooks had never prepared them for. The Kei Islands, also known as the Kei Islands, sit in the southeastern Maluku archipelago of Indonesia. Covering approximately 555 square miles of pristine tropical paradise, these islands became home to Japanese surveillance teams tasked with monitoring Allied movements through the region. What they found instead were waters inhabited by creatures that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. Sergeant Taro Horiba's account remains the most detailed military documentation of Orang Ikan encounters. As leader of a small surveillance unit stationed on a remote Kei Island, Horiba initially dismissed local warnings about strange sea creatures as primitive superstition. Japanese military doctrine emphasized rationality and scientific thinking. There was no place for folklore in their strategic operations. But the sightings began almost immediately. Multiple soldiers reported seeing humanoid figures cavorting in lagoons and swimming near beaches with distinctly human-like breaststrokes. Unlike brief glimpses that could be dismissed as misidentification, these were prolonged observations in clear conditions. The creatures displayed behavior unlike any known marine life. They were seen playing together in shallow waters, their movements suggesting intelligence and social organization. One startled soldier reported approaching what he initially mistook for a child on a beach, only to have the figure turn around, revealing facial features that were disturbingly almost human, but fundamentally wrong. Local villagers weren't surprised by these encounters. When questioned, they calmly explained that these were Orang Ikan, creatures they had coexisted with for generations. The beings were sometimes caught in fishing nets, they explained, and when this happened, the Japanese would be notified. This wasn't folklore to the islanders, it was simply part of their daily reality. The turning point came when the village chief summoned Sergeant Horiba to examine something extraordinary. A dead Orang Ikan had washed ashore, and the villagers wanted the Japanese military leader to see it with his own eyes. What Horiba found sprawled on the grass beside the chief's home defied rational explanation. The creature measured approximately 150 centimeters in length, with pink, salmon-colored skin that seemed to shimmer even in death. Its head bore prominent spines that extended to its shoulders and neck, giving it an almost dragon-like appearance. But most disturbing was its mouth, clearly adapted for a carnivorous diet, filled with needle-like teeth arranged in rows like a carp's, yet designed for tearing rather than filter feeding. The creature's limbs were unmistakably humanoid, but adapted for aquatic life. Its webbed fingers and toes suggested equal comfort in water and on land, while its muscular build indicated a predator capable of swift movement in either environment. This wasn't some crude hoax or misidentified known species. It was a biological impossibility that nonetheless lay before Horiba's eyes. Horiba, a trained military observer, examined the creature thoroughly. There was no known species residing on the island that could possibly account for what he was seeing. The sight of the carcass deeply disturbed him, not just because it challenged his understanding of biology, but because it validated the local folklore he had dismissed. Upon returning to Japan after the war, Horiba attempted to share his experiences with zoologists and scientific institutions. But without photographic evidence, cameras being precious and restricted military equipment, His accounts were met with ridicule. The fact that he had taken no pictures severely undermined his credibility, and his story was largely dismissed as wartime hallucination or fabrication. But Horiba's account wasn't isolated. Other Japanese soldiers in the region reported similar encounters, though most were reluctant to document them officially. The consistency of these accounts across different units and time periods suggests something more substantial than mass hysteria or shared delusion. To understand what Sergeant Horiba and his men saw, we must dive into the ancient folklore they had initially dismissed. Picture this: the emerald waters off the coast of Sumatra, where generations of fishermen have learned to speak in whispers. Not from fear of detection, but from respect. For in these waters dwells something far older than empires, the Orang Ikan, the fish people who have watched over Southeast Asian seas since time immemorial. In Malay, orang means human. Ikan means fish, giving us the perfectly descriptive fishman. But unlike the glamorous mermaids of Western folklore, these beings were never meant to charm sailors to their doom. Instead, they served as guardians, protectors of the oceanic realm who emerged to warn fishermen when they violated the sacred balance of the sea. Traditional Malay folklore paints them not as monsters, but as honored guardians of the water. These weren't creatures of supernatural magic or ancient curses. They were simply wild beings who protected their families and territories, much like any other animal defending its home. What made them remarkable wasn't magical powers, but their humanoid intelligence and their deep connection to the marine ecosystem. The stories had been consistent for generations. Fishermen from the eastern coasts of Sumatra and the islands of Kalimantan reported encounters with amphibious humanoids. Unlike classical mermaids with their fishtails, the Orang Ikan possessed arms and legs, making them true amphibians capable of both underwater and terrestrial movement. Southeast Asian maritime culture has always recognized that water is sacred. In many indigenous traditions, bodies of water contained spiritual beings, some benevolent, others capricious. The Orang Ikan occupied a unique space in this cosmology. They weren't spirits demanding worship or sacrifice, but living creatures deserving of respect and coexistence. Malaysian fishermen developed elaborate protocols around their presence. They knew not to wear green clothing at sea, green being the royal color of sea spirits. They learned to touch the water before throwing nets, asking permission from the spirits who governed these domains. Most importantly, they understood that taking only what was needed preserved the delicate relationship between human communities and the mysterious guardians of the deep. But the Orang Ikan stories possessed something most folklore lacks: geographical specificity and behavioral consistency. Unlike mythical creatures that varied wildly between storytellers, the Orang Ikan were described with remarkable uniformity across different communities and time periods. They were approximately 150 centimeters tall with pink, salmon-colored skin and prominent spines on their heads. Their mouths resembled those of carp, filled with needle-sharp teeth, and their fingers and toes were webbed for aquatic efficiency. This wasn't the stuff of fantasy, it was natural history passed down through oral tradition, detailed enough that director Mike Willouin could recognize their authenticity when researching his recent film. There were many stories of sightings by fishermen of these humanoid sea creatures, cropping up time and time again for over 100 years, Willouin noted. The consistency wasn't coincidental. It suggested something real had been inspiring these accounts generation after generation. To truly understand the Orang Ikan phenomenon, we must dive deeper into the sacred waters of Southeast Asian belief systems. This isn't simply about whether these creatures exist. It's about understanding how traditional cultures preserve and transmit knowledge about their environment across generations. In maritime Southeast Asia, water has always been sacred. Rivers, lakes, and seas weren't just geographical features. They were inhabited realms with their own spiritual authorities and natural laws. The concept of water spirits, whether benevolent guardians or capricious tricksters, appears across the entire region, from the Philippines to Indonesia, from Malaysia to Thailand. But the Orang Ikan occupied a unique position in this cosmology. Unlike the Hantu air, water ghosts that haunted rivers and lakes, or the Naga serpents that commanded weather and tides, the Orang Ikan weren't supernatural entities demanding worship or sacrifice. They were biological beings that happened to bridge the gap between human and marine life. This distinction is crucial for understanding why the Orang Ikan legends persisted with such remarkable consistency. Supernatural beings can shapeshift, appear and disappear at will, and manifest differently to different observers. But the Orang Ikan descriptions remained remarkably standardized across time and geography, suggesting that whatever inspired these stories maintained consistent physical characteristics. Traditional ecological knowledge among Southeast Asian fishing communities is extraordinarily sophisticated. Generations of fishermen developed detailed understanding of marine ecosystems, seasonal patterns, and species behavior that often surpassed formal scientific knowledge. When these communities consistently reported encounters with amphibious humanoids, they weren't engaging in fantasy. They were documenting their environment with the same precision they applied to tracking fish migrations or predicting weather patterns. The cultural role of the Orang Ikan also differed significantly from typical mythological beings. Rather than serving as moral cautionary tales or explanations for natural phenomena, they functioned as coexistence partners in a shared marine environment. Fishermen didn't fear them as demons or worship them as gods. They acknowledged them as fellow inhabitants of the oceanic realm who deserved respect and consideration. This pragmatic approach reflects the broader Southeast Asian worldview that humans share the natural world with various beings. Some visible, some hidden, some benevolent, some neutral. The Orang Ikan stories taught practical lessons about sustainable fishing, territorial respect, and environmental balance rather than abstract moral principles. The persistence of these stories across more than a century suggests they serve functions beyond entertainment or cultural identity. They encode environmental knowledge, establish behavioral protocols for marine activities, and maintain cultural memory of encounters that formal history has forgotten or dismissed. When Sergeant Horiba encountered that dead specimen in 1940, he wasn't just confronting an unknown species, he was witnessing the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern skepticism. The villagers who calmly identified the creature weren't primitive animists projecting fantasies onto nature. They were sophisticated observers sharing their accumulated understanding of their marine environment. Fast forward to 2024, and the Orang Ikan legends are experiencing a remarkable renaissance. Director Mike Willowin's film, Orang Ikan, premiered at the Tokyo International Film Festival, bringing these forgotten creatures to global attention for the first time in decades. But Willowin's approach wasn't to sensationalize or westernize these legends. Instead, he recognized something profound. Southeast Asian mythology offers creatures and stories that haven't been strip-mined by Hollywood. While Western audiences have seen countless vampire, werewolf, and zombie films, the rich folkloric traditions of maritime Southeast Asia remain largely unexplored by mainstream cinema. I'm a big fan of creature art, and this idea of the fishman, or Orang Ikan, came about, Willowin explained. The film deliberately avoided the typical Western monster movie tropes. Rather than depicting the Orang Ikan as supernatural demons or magical beings, Willowin presented them as wild creatures protecting their territory, essentially amphibious wildlife that happens to possess disturbing intelligence and human-like characteristics. This approach honored the original folklore while creating something genuinely fresh for contemporary audiences. The production itself became a celebration of Southeast Asian cinema collaboration, with Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, and the UK working together. Filming locations included Indonesia's stunning geopark Silatu and Curug Sodong in Sukabumi, areas that perfectly captured the remote island atmosphere where such encounters might plausibly occur. Willowin's research uncovered the same historical accounts that we've explored, including the 1943 Japanese military encounters in the Kei Islands. When I researched more into the Orang Ikan, even up till the 1940s, for example, in the Kei Islands in eastern Indonesia, there was a group of soldiers that had sightings of this half-man, half-fish creature, he noted. The filmmaker deliberately wove historical documentation with folkloric tradition, creating a narrative that honored both sources. The film's approach reflects a broader trend in contemporary Southeast Asian cinema, reclaiming local mythologies from colonial dismissal and Western appropriation. Rather than adapting Western monster archetypes to local settings, filmmakers like Willowin are discovering that their own traditions offer creatures and concepts that feel genuinely fresh to global audiences. The critical and festival reception suggests audiences are hungry for these authentic mythological experiences. The Orang Ikan represents something Western monster movies have lost: Creatures that feel genuinely mysterious rather than over-explained, ecologically grounded rather than purely supernatural, and culturally specific rather than generically universal. So what are we to make of the Orang Ikan phenomenon? After examining century-old folklore, wartime military documentation, and contemporary cultural revival, we're left with a puzzle that resists easy resolution. The skeptical explanation is straightforward: misidentification, cultural reinforcement, and the human tendency to mythologize the unknown. But this explanation struggles with the remarkable consistency of descriptions across different time periods, locations, and cultural contexts. The physical characteristics reported by Japanese soldiers in 1943 closely match details preserved in oral traditions dating back generations. Such consistency suggests either an unusually persistent shared delusion or encounters with something real that maintained stable characteristics over time. The biological possibility can't be entirely dismissed. Our oceans remain largely unexplored, with new species discovered regularly. The description of semi-aquatic humanoids, while unlikely, doesn't violate fundamental biological principles. More intriguingly, the Orang Ikan accounts may represent cultural memory of evolutionary history. Southeast Asia's complex history included significant sea level changes that would have driven adaptive pressure on coastal populations. Could these legends preserve ancestral memories of encounters with archaic human relatives? Or unknown hominid variants that adapted to marine environments? The real heart of this mystery isn't just about a creature. It's about a conflict between two ways of knowing. On one side, you have the institutional world of the military and modern science. It is rigid, requires specific forms of proof, a photograph, a specimen, and has no category for things that defy its established order. On the other side, you have the traditional knowledge of the Kei Islanders. It is fluid, observational, built over centuries, and passed down through stories. It has no need for a photograph because the lived experience is its proof. Sergeant Horiba's tragedy wasn't just that he lacked photographic evidence. It was that he operated within an institutional framework that couldn't accommodate his experiences. Military and scientific bureaucracies demand documentation formats that folk encounters rarely provide. By the time stories are filtered through official channels, their essential strangeness has been edited away. The Orang Ikan story ultimately transcends questions of literal existence. In our rush to map, categorize, and explain everything, we may have lost something essential: the capacity to encounter genuine mystery. The Orang Ikan embody this liminal space where certainty dissolves and wonder begins. Sergeant Horiba returned from war haunted not by human enemies, but by the memory of something that shouldn't exist but did. His story reminds us that the world remains larger than our categories, that mysteries persist in the margins of official history, and that indigenous knowledge systems preserve truths that formal institutions might miss. So we ask you, the official records of history are silent on the Orang Ikan. But the oral histories and the documented testimony of the soldiers who were there are not. Which do you trust? The story that was written down and then dismissed? Or the one that has been lived for centuries? Share your thoughts below. Because the truth is often found not in the easy answers, but in the deepest, most mysterious waters.